Astonishing Legends would like to thank Harry's, Best Fiends, The Great Courses Plus, Peloton, and our contributors at patreon.com for making tonight's show possible.
Last week, we had paranormal investigator and author James Willis on the show. As we indicated, that initial interview with him was conducted back in June of this year. Well, a lot has happened since then. In fact, since then, James Willis and I attended and conducted our own investigations at the infamous Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky, just 2 months ago. Well, his was more of an investigation. I was mostly wandering around on my own with a video camera inside the building. More on that in a minute. One thing we're starting to learn at Astonishing Legends is that paranormal investigations, whether they deliver results or not, never work out the way you think they're going to. No doubt some of that is due to the gray areas surrounding the tools we're forced to use to investigate the unknown, but there's more to it than that. Oftentimes, there appears to be a sentient, interactive component to the experience. It's as if the evidence you're trying to capture is playing a game with you, testing your ability to unravel its mysteries. Tonight, we welcome not only James A. Willis back to the show, but another paranormal investigation team and good friends of ours, Roger and Jill Pingleton. We didn't get what we expected to get at Waverly, but what we did get has got us all stumped. And tonight, we invite you to see what you think it might be.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
I do believe in the paranormal. There are things our brains just can't understand. Art Bell, creator and host of Coast to Coast AM.
Join us tonight for our discussion and investigation at Waverly Hills Sanatorium.
And we're back.
Wait, who's that?
That's no one. I was, if I was going to do something, it was going to be Art Bell, but he's got such a deep, characteristic voice. No one can do that.
That was good. Hey, folks, thanks for joining us again for episode 154 of Astonishing Legends. We're so glad to have you with us. Tonight's show is pretty fascinating, but before we get into it, a couple of quick notes.
We're about to be dark 2 weeks as we make our final preparations for October shows. But there is a silver lining in those 2 weeks of darkness, in the form of the launch of a new show from Astonishing Legends Productions.
That's right, we alluded to this last week, but the time is drawing nigh. So we'll remind you again that a new podcast called The Midnight Library is dropping on Saturday, October 5th.
We'll be releasing the first episode of The Midnight Library into our main feed that day, which would have been a dark week for Astonishing Legends without it.
The Midnight Library is the culmination of a collaborative project between Astonishing Legends and Ms. Miranda Merrick, the head librarian and master of special collections there. In addition to Ms. Merrick, you'll meet her ever-present closest confidant, Mr. Darling, who will see you safely in and back out of the library. Because without guidance, well, it's easy to get lost forever within.
So look for that premiere to be released on the Astonishing Legends feed on October 5th. You can also go ahead and subscribe to it by searching, as we all do, for the Midnight Library, wherever you get your podcasts, including Himalaya. Subscribers will find that a brief introduction to the show has already been posted and will be treated to weekly episodes for 8 weeks in a row as part of Season 1 of the show.
While the topics run in a similar vein to Astonishing Legends, you'll find they're presented in an entirely different way, as Ms. Merrick conducts weekly readings, wonderfully darkened by her, well, let's just say, unique perspective on the world. Episode 1 will take you deep into the Paris catacombs.
Alrighty then, let's head to Louisville, Kentucky and the Waverly Hills Sanatorium. So what is the Waverly Sanatorium? What is a sanatorium? And what is tuberculosis, if that's what was being treated there? Well, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium is best known as being a former and formerly abandoned rest and recuperation medical facility on the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky for patients suffering from tuberculosis in the early 1900s. What's a sanatorium, you ask? Well, first off, some people confuse the name Waverly Hills Sanatorium with sanitarium. And that's understandable because sanatorium and sanitarium are often interchanged, and according to Grammarist.com, both words mean essentially the same thing, a facility where people with chronic illnesses or a need for a long-term convalescence are treated, and they were established in the 1800s, mostly for tuberculosis. Before the development of antibiotics, the main form of treatment back then, especially for diseases like tuberculosis, was to first isolate those infected from the healthy population, and second, give those infected patients a place to rest and try and let the body heal itself, mostly aided by fresh air, decent food, and a medical staffed environment where they could just lie in bed and rest. And the word sanitarium is interchangeable with sanatorium as their definitions are very close, except sanitarium is primarily a North American word, and the slight difference in the terms comes from their Latin origin. Sanatorium derived from the late Latin word sanatorius, meaning health-giving. Sanitarium comes from the Latin word sanitas, meaning health. So there you go. You've been wondering, I'm sure. And I always like to clear up those things when people have a long-held name that they're misstating.
Yeah.
Because I do it myself a lot. And so
No, I was worried about this one, and I always presumed that whatever I would say, it would be the wrong version of it.
Yeah.
And sanitarium sounded like it had something to do with janitors, so I figured that.
Kind of cleanliness, health. Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about tuberculosis. You might think tuberculosis is an old-timey disease, long since eradicated, that you could only read about in Gothic novels, but in fact, it's still a major threat to global health safety. Tuberculosis, or as a lot of people commonly know it, TB, is highly infectious and it generally affects the lungs, but it can also get to your other body parts. It's usually caused by the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacteria, or MTB. And most infections are classified as latent tuberculosis, meaning they don't show any symptoms. Now, around 10% of these latent infections will progress to the active form of the disease, and if it's not treated, it's going to kill about half the people infected with it. Chronic cough with bloody mucus, night sweats, fever, weight loss, and getting a really pale and sickly complexion are the classic symptoms of tuberculosis or TB. It's this dramatic weight loss that gives rise to the historically colloquial term consumption for TB, like one is being consumed, and it was the extreme ashen paleness of the skin that historically gave TB the label, the Great White Plague. One of the things that I always think about with TB is Val Kilmer.
Yeah, we just talked about the movie Tombstone.
Yes.
Remember? It features Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday, who famously had the disease in real life. And in one scene, Johnny Ringo, portrayed by Michael Biehn, he calls Doc a lunger.
A lunger, yeah.
Yeah, which was a slightly derogatory slang term for people with TB back in the day.
Well, poor Doc, he actually died at the age of 36 in November of 1887 in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, which had springs, which he had gone there, in much the same reason that people would go to Waverly, because that's how it was thought that you were going to get better, was to go and get the fresh air and the clean water and be in a sanitary as opposed to a sanatory environment.
Okay, now you're just making up stuff.
Yeah, I'm just making it up.
But a serene, peaceful environment thought it would help, and a positive mental outlook and a place where they could just rest undisturbed. Well, tell us how it spreads, because it's very easy to catch it.
Yeah, it's very contagious. It can actually be spread through the air by people with the active form of the disease when they cough or they sneeze, or just by spitting or speaking, but it doesn't spread from people with the latent form of TB. People who are then at high risk of catching it are those in close contact with people who have the active form of it, whether at home, work, or socially. And nowadays, there's the Bacillus calmette-guerin vaccine to aid in prevention. That, in combination with screening those at high risk and early detection and treatment of cases that arise, can help protect you from getting it. It's thought that Doc Holliday might have caught it from his mother.
Yeah, anybody that's in close contact. And, like we said, they didn't really understand it. They just knew that people who were close to those infected, once they started to show the signs of the active form of TB, that's when it was contagious. So they needed to isolate those people.
Yeah, and you have to be pretty courageous as a healthcare worker to work with these folks, because you're taking a certain amount of risk there. So getting to the treatment, people who had tuberculosis, they would have to have multiple antibiotics over a long period of time in order to be properly treated for it. Now, that's nowadays. Back in the day of the Waverly Sanatorium, before the advent of vaccines or antibiotics, the main method of prevention was simply isolating the patients from other folks, which is why the staff of Waverly actually lived there and it had its own means of storing and making food. However, they were allowed to go home for short visits, which doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense, along with letting some relatives visit certain patients, which it's speculation, but it probably must have been people who were at very early stages of
Possibly, yeah. What's been said over and over is that some patients were allowed visits from family members, and after visitation day, they would just go home again, back out into the populace. But I believe doctors, nurses, maintenance people, whoever worked there as staff, once you were up there, you stayed there, you lived there for a while, and you might wonder why would somebody take a job like that? Well, for a doctor, it's an interesting way, if you're interested in that particular disease, to study it, and it's a controlled environment, and it's a good hospital at the time. If you were just working there, you might wonder, like, well, why would you take a job like that? Well, this is around the time of the Depression, so you were lucky to have any job.
Right.
So, yeah, it's not a bad job, other than you have to stay up there.
When at the time there was no antibiotics. So the best and most non-invasive cure thought to be effective was, like we said, fresh air, a lot of fresh air, which is why Waverly has the big balconies that are open to the outdoors.
Mhm.
And you're supposed to get that air year-round, including the wintertime. There's actually photos, and they're pretty amazing. You can see them in the show notes with this episode, of patients out in their beds outside on that balcony with snow on their blankets. So the concept of a fresh air cure led to that design where on the backside of the building, there's this whole inner row of patient rooms adjacent to long hallways. And outside of those rows, there are these long, open, connected balconies, which we now know from the blueprints that we have received during the course of our research into the show. Thank you to Roger Pingleton for that. You'll be hearing from him later. It's called the Sun Corridor. So that was the outside area, the Sun Corridor. It's kind of creepy for some reason. I don't know. It's like, hey, it's the Sun Corridor. It's happy and fun. It's like, no, it's not. It's not happy and fun.
Well, to make this clear, so you can understand how the layout is, and I know this is a little unusual for buildings because normally they don't have this open air kind of policy. What you have, imagine a long hallway, like in a school or any other building, like a hospital. So on either side of this hallway, there are patient rooms, and they're all adjacent. And there's a door and there's glass. And if you keep going further out towards the outer wall of the building, at the end where the patient room stops, there's another wall with glass and doors. That leads out into this long open balcony.
The Sun Corridor.
Yeah, I don't know if it was called the Sun Corridor all the way around the building.
It is. I'm looking at the blueprints.
Well, there you go then. All right. Well, you're getting sun. That's the idea, is that you have this long, wide, open balcony. And so if you look at the building from the ground, from the outside, it looks like there are windows, these large rectangular and square, and then some of the windows are shaped in portrait format as a rectangle. Well, a lot of those on the one section of the building, there's no glass, nor was there ever glass in them. They're totally open. So the idea was that on this outer balcony, the patients' rooms could be open from that side. The patients could be wheeled out on that balcony so they could get the fresh air coming in. So what's kind of creepy about it is that you can wander in and you'd be down the hallway. You can wander through an open door of a patient's room and go right out into that open air balcony and look straight out onto the grounds.
Right.
It's very open, but that was the idea of the place. And I'm sure it was airy and breezy and nice in the summer.
It sounds kind of cool. I mean, it's like how they build houses in Mexico.
There aren't any
walls.
Yeah,
I love it.
There's an open breeze thing. There's a picture of people where they are wheeled out onto the grounds, I think, and there is snow on their blankets. And I believe, as it was described to me, as these patients were wheeled out in winter, the feet of their beds, there'd be snow on their blankets.
Yeah.
So you just bundled people up enough, and they thought, like, cold, crisp, fresh air, that was the best thing, first of all. And of course, there were a lot of other treatments they were trying that were experimental that just sound worse than the disease itself. But they honestly were trying everything they could to cure this disease with very little knowledge of what it really was. And although these cures were well-meaning, they were pretty gruesome, and actually some patients got better despite them. Just probably on their own, though.
So according to the wiki entry on tuberculosis for the modern stats, there were more than 10 million cases of active TB in 2017, leading to 1.6 million deaths worldwide, with about 1% of the population coming down with new infections each year. Those statistics make tuberculosis the number one cause of death from an infectious disease in 2017. It continues to be a scourge to the human race, with 1/4 of the world's population thought to be infected as of 2018. Tuberculosis is slowly on the decline, but it's been with us since ancient times and up until this day.
Yeah, it's one of those things that here in the States, at least, you don't hear a lot about except in history books and watching movies. However, in developing countries, in Asia, it's quite prevalent, especially the non-active form of it, the latent form of TB. So it's still out there, and it takes a lot of lives worldwide. It's still a scourge.
Before and through the turn of the century, it's said that the Louisville area had an unusually high number of tuberculosis cases in the region, and it's debated why, but some believe this was because of the swampy and humid climate of the land that borders the Ohio River. So Louisville was in need of a good TB sanatorium. But how did this now notorious building, which some have labeled as one of the most haunted places in the world, get its start? And what may have made it so haunted? Let's take a look at the early history of the Waverly Hills Sanatorium.
Well, folks, we're going to keep this brief as we can, and I'm sure a lot of you will appreciate that out there. But we have a lot of interview to get to, so this is just a real brief rundown of the history of that building itself. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium didn't start off as the only building on that particular hill in Louisville. In 1883, Major Thomas H. Hayes purchased the land for his family home. But there weren't any nearby schools for his daughters to attend, so he had a one-room schoolhouse built on what was then Page's Lane. He then hired Lizzie Lee Harris to become the new teacher. And Lizzie Lee Harris was a big fan of Scottish author, poet, playwright, and historian Sir Walter Scott and his series of Waverly novels, as they were called, so she named the schoolhouse the Waverly School. And Major Thomas Hayes liked the sound of it, so he named his land Waverly Hills. Due to an epidemic of tuberculosis in the Louisville and Jefferson County areas in the early 1900s, and as we said, some say because of the wetlands around the Ohio River and that being a good breeding ground for the bacteria, but that's debated, the Board of Tuberculosis Hospitals had decided that a sanatorium should be built on Waverly Hill because of the frequent breeze and the out-of-the-way location surrounded by peaceful woods. This first original TV facility was a wooden two-story structure with a hip roof and half timbering that had a main administrative building and 2 open-air pavilions to house 20 patients each, those who had the early stages of the disease, and 40 to 50 patients were treated there. Construction began in 1908 and the facility opened on July 26, 1910. Now, a new Louisville City Hospital was in the planning stages at the start of 1911, but the hospital commissioners had decided that there would be no provisions made for the admission of patients with the pulmonary form of TB at this new facility, so the Board of Tuberculosis Hospital was given $25,000 to help the founding of a facility specifically for the treatment of advanced TB cases. The board purchased the land on Waverly Hill to build this new sanatorium and kept the name Waverly, except this original spelling of Waverly, just as in Sir Walter Scott's novel Waverly and his series of books around the same time and themes. Waverly was spelled Waverley. Today it's spelled Waverly without that extra E at the end. Now it's not clear when this E-less spelling stuck over the years, but it has been spelled either way during that time and is now spelled with just the one E. Waverly.
You know what's interesting about that is $25,000. That is a lot of money in 1911. Just while you were talking about this right now, I looked it up. That would be $380,000 today. So
yeah, it's enough to get it started.
Good chunk of change.
Yeah, they realized the importance of this, and you know, if you let it go, how many people are going to be affected? I mean, how many people are around people breathing?
Humanity is crisis motivated.
Exactly. So they had to do something about it, and the Louisville area was in crisis mode here. So while this permanent sanatorium structure for the advanced cases was being built, all the TB patients from the city hospital were relocated to temporary tents on the Waverly Hills property on August 31st, 1912. Another 40 patients with advanced cases would be treated at the hospital in December of 1912, and in 1914, a children's pavilion was added to accommodate another 50 beds, raising the occupancy to around 130 patients. This new children's pavilion housed not only kids sick with tuberculosis, but also children whose parents had contracted TB and could not be otherwise adequately cared for. So just imagine that, in that children, if your child got it, you it was taken away from you.
It's horrible.
And you might be able to go visit them every once in a while, but they were there and you just hoped and prayed that they got better. And if you were a child and your parents got it, you had to be separated from them. Well, here you're at the facility at least because no one was around to take care of you. So these were harsh times. Well, according to the report of the Board of Tuberculosis Hospitals from 1915, they plan to add a new building each year to meet the rising demand for beds. So perhaps around this time, Waverly had 140 patients or more in kind of ad hoc conditions. So they knew that they would just get more and more and more patients, and they would kind of languish for a while, and they would probably die, and new people would be coming in all the time. So they knew they had to grow this site.
Well, in March of 1924, due to the rising need for more and more beds and the need for a more durable structure other than a wood building, construction actually began on a 5-story structure that could house 400 or more patients. This new facility opened on October 17th, 1926. 1926 and 27 always stand out to me because of my film history stuff that I learned in college.
Yeah.
1927 being the year of the first talkie. So this was, it opened the year before the first talkie, which was the jazz singer, Al
Yeah.
Jolson. Also, Metropolis, another one of my favorite movies, came out in 1927. In 1943, the antibiotic streptomycin was developed and was effective in the treatment of tuberculosis, although it had a host of unpleasant side effects, including causing deafness if given to pregnant mothers. Streptomycin is used to treat several other bacterial infections such as plague, tularemia, also known as rabbit fever, and rat bite fever.
You ever hear that? I think it was a Ted Nugent album, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was cat scratch.
Oh, sorry.
In cases of active tuberculosis, it's often given together with isoniazid, rifampicin, and pyrazinamide. This is your revenge on me. You're like, hey,
yeah.
Forrest was like, hey, you read this next bit from the outline.
Yeah.
Quote, it is given by injection into a vein or muscle, end quote. So
yeah, that's how they delivered it.
Yeah, so which hurts too, by the way. With streptomycin being an effective treatment, the number of TB cases gradually dwindled in the following years, and the need for a massive and expensive to run TB hospital no longer existed. The Waverly Hills Sanatorium closed its doors in June of 1961, and the remaining patients were sent to Hazelwood Sanatorium in Louisville.
But during its heyday, when tuberculosis had become an epidemic in Jefferson County, Kentucky, Waverly Hills Sanatorium was its own little self-contained village in a way. It had its own post office and zip code, its own water treatment facility. That's the bunkhouse that I stayed in.
Oh, very cool.
Well, the water cairns there, the big concrete blocks.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And
Did
really
you actually
well done.
sleep where the water was stored?
Yes.
Wow, that's
yeah.
pretty cool.
That's
Okay.
They turn those into rooms, and they're
Okay.
really nicely kind of furnished rooms. And there's a bathroom and shower next
Oh.
door, and you can make snacks. And there's a in the center there's a little table you can kind of hang out. They're bunk beds.
Yeah.
It's the bunkhouse.
Yeah.
And in the entranceway, they have those large metal pumps that used to pump the water up to the facility.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, so it's really well done. The owners, the Mattingleys, have done a great job with it. So, but as you mentioned before, this place was its own little town here. It grew its own fruits and vegetables right on the property, and they farmed livestock for meat. And this was all so they could provide for their own food and have everything they needed for daily life on the hill, away from the rest of the populace. And there was a large cafeteria on the first floor, also a reportedly very haunted location within the building, where apparently the staff and patients both ate. I imagine there's some kind of separate sections there. You probably wouldn't want to be eating next to the patients, but again, it's like, yeah, exactly. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I just got TB.
Are you kidding me?
You just sneezed on my eggs. Yeah.
Yeah.
But speaking of eggs, though, some have claimed that they can still smell bread baking and bacon frying in the abandoned cafeteria. You can still smell food cooking. That is an aspect I've heard quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not really maybe a ghost thing, but an echo thing. And it's also a sensory echo thing. One great story I heard from a guy, I don't know if he wrote into us or not, but he thought his mom was home one day, and he was home from college or something. He came downstairs because he thought his mom was making breakfast. He smelled bacon and eggs and coffee brewing and pots and pans clanking, and his mom was not downstairs. It was empty. And then his mom came in from the laundry room, said, "What are you doing?" So that happens sometimes.
Yeah.
That kind of residual noise and smells and that kind of thing. And it happens here apparently in the cafeteria and the kitchen area of Waverly. But The reason for this building being self-sufficient was that, although TB was an airborne transmitted bacterial disease, that wasn't fully understood at the time, at least not for its cure anyway. I'm sure they understood that proximity caused that. That's why they isolated people, but they weren't fully understanding of the bacterial nature of it and certainly tried a bunch of different things to cure it. Most of them, well, not
Ineffective.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, but probably you're right. They're not effective because some people did get better, but in spite of the treatments. But they knew that these patients needed to be quarantined to prevent further transmission of this highly contagious disease, and those infected could not be permitted to live amongst the healthy population. So that's pretty simple, keep them isolated. So in light of this, anyone who was a patient or worked there in any capacity was required to live there. Doctors, nurses, maintenance staff, as I just said, as well as the patients, and they became long-term residents of what was called living, quote, on the hill, unquote. But strangely, as we just previously mentioned, many patients got visits from family members on visiting day. So I don't know if this is from the aspect of not fully understanding the disease or just like, you know what, they're probably, they're not going to make it. Let them, I don't know what the reason would be for letting healthy family members come up to visit, other than they may have, I would guess, not be advanced cases yet. But during its time, Waverly Hills Sanatorium was considered one of the most modern and well-equipped medical facilities of the day, and it could attend to a large number of patients, over 400. So it was a big, serious facility. And that's why the building is so substantial, I think, and probably why it's lasted, and it's considered such a monument, not only to Louisville history, but also to medical science and representative of a bygone era in medical history. So what kind of treatments were going on at Waverly, other than the fresh air plan that all the patients were getting? Well, as we said at the top, they sound barbaric, and they were. But at the time, that's all they knew to do. Again, remember, this is before the advent of antibiotics, so they had to take a more physical approach, as you could say, using the knowledge that they did and genuinely trying to help these people because it was a scourge. They had to do something rather than just warehouse these people and wait for them to die. That's not a great plan because people are just piling up here. So the things that they did, well, what they knew was the sun kills germs, right? UV light. So they either applied these large sun lamps, and I believe for a long time in the hospital itself, they probably have been moved out. I don't think I saw them, or maybe I saw the stands for these lights downstairs in the treatment room. They use these sun lamps. Now, people back in the day who grew up in the 70s and 80s remember these. Sylvania made them, and they're basically like putting somebody in the roast beef carving station at Golden Corral.
Yeah.
They just kind of kept you hot and cooked you, and you can get a sunburn, I think, eventually. You remember people in high school trying that, and you basically just end up red. You come into school with a red burn on your face. But here's the disturbing part of that. The other thing I read was possibly they were exposing people's lungs directly, meaning they opened you up and then shone the sun lamp onto your lungs, which means they would have to peel all that away to get the sun lamps on them. I think it's more likely it was just over the body, but who knows? Again, some of these were really invasive. One thing was to actually go in, and they know it affected the lungs, so they thought, well, let's go in and deflate one lung, because maybe if just one lung's working, it will let the other one heal. Give it some rest. So it's not working, it can rest, it can recuperate, then do the same with the other lung. That didn't always work. The other one that's a little more gruesome is going in with a balloon and inflating the lung and just stretching it out, maybe causing some agitation down there in the lung will get the body to start attacking this disease. That didn't always work. The other one, I think, maybe in conjunction with inflating the lungs with the balloons, or maybe just releasing pressure on the areas that they would sometimes remove ribs, the bottom 2 or 3 ribs. So there's people who have lived through this. One guy actually went on, he lived through this, but you develop a hunch.
Yeah.
Here's what's strange about that. A lot of people have seen a hunched over ghost. So could it be somebody who was there who went through this procedure and didn't live through it? Or live through it, return, who knows? But the hunched over part, yeah, that's an aspect of that procedure where now you're kind of slumping over a little bit because you don't have the ribs to support you. So those were some awful treatments. But the other one, yeah, I think going in and also manually manipulating the lung with your hands, which that actually sounds like a Viking torture a friend of mine told me about that he'd read about, where the Vikings would do that just to mess with your breathing.
Ugh.
But those reportedly are some of the treatments that were used, and we have not ran those down to check the veracity of them, but that's what's often reported. And if you know anything about medical history, yeah, some gruesome things were tried in the name of science, in the name of helping people. So that's all they knew to do was get more oxygen in there, get some fresh air in there, and if you can't do it on your own, we're going to open you up and try it manually. So that just adds to the pain, the misery of people that were staying there. And I think it ties in with something we're going to talk about at the end of the show. Those years and years of pain and suffering and just recovery and recuperation and sickness. It may have manifested itself and it may resonate there. And it may be why that place is so haunted. Well, this building itself, which is in the architecture style of early 20th century Tudor Gothic revival, and it's also listed on the National Historic Register, it's currently being restored by private owners Charles and Tina Mattingly and the Waverly Hills Historical Society. But before, it was in danger of being torn down. But before that, the old sanatorium had another secondary life as an institution, one that also saw more than its fair share of pain, misery, and death. And another reason, perhaps, why it's so haunted. So after it had its life as the Waverly Sanatorium, the building was closed down, quarantined, and then renovated and reopened a year later in 1962 as Woodhaven Medical Services, or the Woodhaven Geriatric Center. The building served as a nursing home for elderly patients, most with diminished mental capacities from dementia or mobility issues, and the patients with severe mental challenges were also treated there. However, it turned out Woodhaven was not a successful facility or a great place to be looked after in your final years. Possibly due to the massive size of the building and the large number of beds it could hold, the facility was, of course, overcrowded, and it seems became a dumping ground for these types of patients. It was also, of course, greatly understaffed, and reports of patient neglect, either willful or unintentional, began to surface, and the state of Kentucky closed down Woodhaven in 1982. And in the following years, there were a few other ideas on what to do with the Waverly building, rather than let such a solid and historic building be torn down. But as with a lot of ideas from land developers, some ideas didn't work out that well. What's the next one, Scott?
Well, they were going to turn it into a prison. It was actually bought for $3 million in 1983 by a real estate developer from Simpsonville named J. Clifford Todd, and he and his partner, an architect named Milton Thompson, were going to make it a minimum security state prison, but the neighbors were not down with that, and the plans got dropped in favor of turning it into apartments. But that depended on the Jefferson County Fiscal Court purchasing about 140 acres of land from them for a price of $400,000 so they could have the funds to start the project, and apparently that never got off the ground. The next thing that's really fascinating, and this comes up whenever you look up Waverly, there's all this talk about the Jesus statue. The building and the surrounding land on it was purchased in March of 1996 by Robert Alberhaske, who was inspired by the famous and massive monument of Jesus, the Christ, the Redeemer statue on Corcovado Mountain in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And Alberhaske had plans to build the world's tallest statue of Jesus, which was supposed to sit atop the roof at Waverly. Now, not sure how the roof was going to support it, but that was the plan, and he had the help of partners Ed Hamilton, a local sculptor, and Jasper Ward, an architect. It was planned to be 150 feet tall, or 46 meters, and 150 wide, with the first phase of its building costing $4 million. This is 1996. The Christ the Redeemer statue on Corcovado Mountain in Brazil stands 98 feet tall, or 30 meters, and 125 feet tall with its pedestal. Now, the second phase of the building would have cost $8 million or more and converted the main building into a worship chapel with an art center, a theater, and, of course, a gift shop. However, the whole project was canceled in December of 97 when the donations taken in only amounted to around $3,000 after a full year of national fundraising. The Jesus statue never came to pass.
No, it would have been massive, though. I don't know how you could put that on the on the roof unless it was really light.
Yeah.
Some kind of very light material, hollow, fiberglass, something like that.
Which
But
would be a smart thing to put on top of a hill subject to local winds.
Well,
Yes.
yeah, I don't know. Would have been impressive, but never happened. Well, what happened after that? Sadly, as the Waverly building changed hands over the years after its last days as a medical facility, little was done to keep up the general maintenance on the building and to keep vandals from damaging the place, breaking things and spray painting. It was nearly condemned at one point. And for decades before the current owners took possession, like any abandoned building, Waverly was a popular hideout for the young people of Louisville to, have their fun away from their parents and authorities, of course. But don't try that nowadays, kids. That is strictly off limits. But Waverly would end up having actually a happy ending of sorts and a chance for resurrection and a new life. And it couldn't be in better hands now as it continues to be restored. Because in 2001, Charles and Tina Mattingly purchased the building and have been making many improvements and changes to the building and the surrounding property ever since. They've been working with the Waverly Hills Society, and all three are, I could tell you, really dedicated to the preservation of Waverly Hills Sanatorium as a piece of history. And as the official website says, Charles, Tina, and the Waverly Hills Historical Society, quote, continue to work tirelessly and devote their lives to restoring the historical gem that is Waverly Hills to its once amazing splendor. The Waverly Hills Historical Society is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to the preservation and restoration of Waverly Hills Sanatorium, the history of its past employees and patients, as well as the education of the public of the history of TB and its effect on the area. And it had a great effect on the area. Louisville was devastated around the turn of the century by this, and it's part of their history. So they are very genuine and dedicated people, and they've spent all this time and money getting this thing slowly back in shape. And I think there is talk of a hotel and conference center one day, rather than just what it is now. It's still, so when you see it, yeah, it looks a little derelict, but you've got to realize how much two people in a small society have done. They've gone through and replaced a lot of the windows that have been busted out. And I'm not sure this figure, but I heard like each one is $10,000 each, something crazy.
Yeah.
There's hundreds of windows.
Yeah.
But right now in its current state, it's still a great place to go visit, especially if you love something spooky. And guess what? Coming up Halloween here, they run a really successful and big and spectacular haunted house there. You can imagine this. You can have a haunted house at Universal Studios in a warehouse or somebody's, rented warehouse. Imagine having a haunted house in a real haunted building.
Yeah.
When it's severely haunted. You might get the guy, of course, with the bloody shirt, who's the crazy doctor coming at you. And then there may be an actual ghost that looks like a doctor coming at you. So, and that is in addition to the tours you can take as a private person or in groups. If you're ghost hunters, you can sign up to go do an overnight investigation like we did, or just go on a several-hour tour. It's very thorough. They take you all over. They tell you all the stories. I highly recommend it. And the other thing they do is a big event, and this sounded a little odd. They have a Christmas laser light show, which is really a spectacular thing. It's like, but you know what? A lot of people don't associate Christmas with anything spooky, but it is a very spiritually active time. But they have a giant laser light show there, and I guess it's quite something. So they have fun events there like cosplay zombie tours and all kinds of things. Go check out the website. We'll have that posted. That is therealwaverlyhills.com, and there's all kinds of events there. But yeah, you can just be a regular person like ourselves and go check out the place for yourself.
One final important note about it, you must have a reservation or a ticket to visit Waverly. There is absolutely no trespassing allowed at any time. So keep that in mind. It's not an abandoned building with nobody watching it anymore.
No, they're very respectful of the building, its history. I mean, lucky for us, they're really not only into the history of the place, but they're paranormal enthusiasts, which is fortunate for the building itself, but also for people who want to go check it out for the reason that it is haunted. But they do not put up with any monkey business. There is tight security all the way around the building with cameras. It's completely monitored. And as I said, when we were there, as soon as somebody came on the property who just kind of wandered on, and I think in their car driving up the lane, they were on them within a minute.
Yeah.
And just turned them around. And people were like, oh, well, we didn't know it was private property. Like, okay, well, people still try and get up there. So yeah, I wouldn't try that. But the other thing I'll say about the Mattinglys is that in addition to being respectful of the building, they are very respectful of any spirits that might be there. And having worked there that long, since 2001, they've seen their fair share of strange sights and spirits, and they totally believe it, that there's something about that place. But they are very respectful and dedicated to maintaining the sanctity of it. So you can go check it out, but they don't allow any kind of provoking or like goofing around. You have to be respectful too if you're gonna go check it out.
So our sponsors usually send us some talking points or things they'd like us to hit on when we do a spot. And this is one of the first times I learned a new historical fact from the ones we just got from Harry's.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to me. Humans have been shaving for over 5,000 years.
Wow.
They've been using flint tools, shark's teeth, and eventually the first copper razor, I guess.
Yeah, it's so funny. I guess when you look back on history and compare it to what you do day to day, you don't always think about the parts of it that people have been doing for thousands of years. I mean, at some point, some ancient iteration of mankind was like, my beard is bothering me. What can I do to clean it up or remove it?
Exactly, to quote you.
Oh,
I
nice.
still don't sound like you.
Okay.
And that guy didn't have a razor with flex balls or heated handles, did he?
Oh, here we go.
My point is that Harry's focuses on the qualities in a razor that actually matter for a close, comfortable shave. And even better, they never upcharge you for some gimmick that you don't need. Join the 10 million who have tried Harry's. Claim your special trial offer by going to harrys.com/legends.
I've honestly been using Harry's for years, way before they even sponsored us. Well, actually, before we even started the show, and I'm still with them because their razors are affordable, incredibly well made, and they work. And I get a great shave every time I use them.
Harry's doesn't have any gimmicks, just quality, durable blades at a fair price of only $2 per blade. They keep prices low by cutting out the middleman.
And we've said this before, but Harry's has their own world-class blade factory in Germany. It's been around for 99 years, since well before they started. But now it belongs to them, and that's one of the main reasons you get such an amazing shave from their blades.
With no middlemen and factory direct pricing, you're getting a great deal on a great product.
They also donate 1% of their sales to organizations that provide access to mental health care for men.
And you can try them out risk-free. If you don't love your shave, just let them know and they'll give you a full refund.
Listeners of our show can redeem their Harry's trial set at harrys.com/legends. You'll get a weighted ergonomic handle for a firm grip, 5-blade razor with a lubricating strip and trimmer blade, rich lathering shave gel with aloe to keep your skin hydrated, and a travel blade cover to keep your razor dry and easy on the go.
Go to harrys.com/legends to start shaving better today.
That's harrys.com/legends to start shaving better today.
Hi, I'm Michael, part-time zookeeper and full-time mystery hunter. And I can tell you for a fact that my animals love Astonishing Legends. So let's get back to the show.
All right, so before we have our conversation with Jim Willis, let's, of course, talk about some of the more famous ghost stories. The stories of the residents who never left Waverly, apparently, and are still there, and occasionally make an appearance, according to many who visit.
I think the first one we should talk about is one that our guests have already heard about, which is the Creeper, which is the one that Jim was trying to get to come out in the last episode that you heard last week when he went back, and he has since gone back and tried to get the Creeper to appear again, which we'll talk about tonight.
Right.
The Creeper is an interesting figure. It's not just something that he's looking for, it's something that a lot of people have seen.
Well, I should preface this whole section here by saying the stories that we're going to relay are the ones that are most often relayed by everybody. The tour guides, blogs, and people who have visited, and I'm sure researchers, but everyone listening should keep this in mind. As with many legends, they are really hard to pin down in a lot of cases as to what exactly is the real story. What are the facts? And as we've often said, there usually is a kernel or two of truth in there, but a legend has grown around it like a limb lopped off from a tree. It just forms around it and it grows. And over the years, these are what's been distilled down to as the common legends. So there are, of course, many variations and people add stuff for dramatic effect. I think the Jersey Devil was the first time it's like, okay, here are two stories that are possibilities of this really old legend, but over the years, it's the telephone game, it's Chinese whispers, it's all these things that build around a story, the callus that it builds, to finally rest as something that's just commonly told. So keep that in mind as we go. And what I mean in relation to that, as far as Jim's story, is that people have seen stuff over the years. I don't think that these stories would continue and be continued to be retold if people weren't experiencing real stuff there now. And that's kind of what James is saying, is that he has seen and experienced stuff there. And as far as the creeper goes, I've heard stories and credible reports from people that have seen variations of a shadow type entity or some kind of black fog or mist or sludge. And this one, though, in particular, that he calls the creeper, was known to hang out near the ceiling. That was one defining characteristic of this creeper entity. So that's why he was looking towards the ceiling. So that's why some of our team members, Jill and Roger Pingleton and James himself, we were all kind of looking towards the ceiling. And there may have been an actual anomaly in the laser grid one of us found. So that was interesting. They each have their quirks and things that they do, these ghosts and different types of entities. And there's even one report that I read of some kind of elemental creature. And all I can describe is that it's not really a ghost in the terms of definitions. It's not really a spirit as we come to think of it, of a dead person. It's not a demon per se. It is something in between, some weird creature that people have seen. So specifically, the creeper is the entity that James was trying to bait into making another appearance on this occasion. And that's the setup of the experiment that we were trying to recreate when something weird happened to him in a previous visit.
Yeah.
Oh, and another thing I want to discuss before we get into the specific spooks there is, like a lot of haunted locations, there does seem to be a connection to the locations within the building or place. And at Waverly, since it's so huge, there are ghosts that reside specifically on the 5th floor or the 4th floor, the cafeteria. They have their places they seem to like to hang out, or they're just repeating their actions in life, whatever it is. One place I think we haven't mentioned yet, which is part of the architecture of Waverly, and I think for me, probably the creepiest, spookiest place, just because of its nature and how it's laid out, is something called the Death Tunnel. And there is, of course, like a lot of Waverly, debate about what its purpose was and function and what it actually did for the patients and staff there. But essentially, the Death Tunnel it's a corridor, it's a tube. It looks like a smaller subway tube, 500 feet from the top of it to the bottom, kind of going down the hill. And I'll just tell you now what the lore is about that. So in reality, the purpose of it does seem to have been to ferry supplies from the bottom of the hill up to the top as an easy method, rather than trying to drive it up there or cart it up there. And you can see the metal moorings that were in the concrete as kind of an anchor point. And there was probably a pulley system with a cable. And at the bottom of the tunnel, on the floor, on the left side are stairs, and the other half of the bottom of the floor is a smooth ramp surface.
This is as you're the top of the hill looking down.
Yeah, actually, if you're looking down into, and that's where you start, because the bottom of the hill, which I actually saw it, I have pictures of, I'll put them on the website. The bottom of the hill, it's overgrown, and the entrance is a concrete bunker of sorts that was demolished over the years and pared down to probably what it originally was. But you can still see there's an outer door that opened, and inside an inner door, a gate of sorts, which is more like a chain link fence, but with a door in it. And that was the entrance to the tunnel at the bottom. And you would make your way up after you've loaded your supplies, I presume, in the cart, and it was pulleyed up. And then you could walk up that on the right side. If you're looking up the hill, your stairs would be on the right side. The supplies would go on the left.
That's a pretty good walk, 500 feet.
It is a bit of a walk to get down there, yeah. And so that's what also makes it creepy, because there's no electricity there. It echoes.
Yeah.
It's spooky. It's dark at the bottom of it. And as you'll hear later in our discussion with James, he was kind of chiding me for not
going all the way down.
I did walk down quite a ways by myself, but I was totally cut off from the tour. And I thought, if for some reason the door closes, I get trapped down here, it's the worst place in Waverly to be trapped until they actually come down and investigate. So that was one place that everybody goes in the investigation, because there's a lot of activity there. But here's a little bit about the psychological need, perhaps, for this tunnel. And, of course, the legend that sparks up around that. At the time, so many people were dying at Waverly that it was not beneficial for the other patients to see people they might even know or have talked to earlier that day now being carted out of the hospital because they died. Doctors then believe, as they do now, that a positive mental outlook and positive attitude about your recovery was necessary. And seeing a lot of people constantly being carted out, as we said, that one figure, perhaps one per hour at the height of it, would be terribly demoralizing to people there trying to recover. So imagine this, several times a day, a hearse or ambulance would pull up and cart people away. Well, they wanted to shield the other patients from that. So in a way, as supplies were going up, bodies were coming down the tunnel. And so many bodies were being carted down on a daily basis to an awaiting ambulance or hearse that left an imprint. And that's why it's called the death tunnel. But the point of contention is whether that tunnel was built for that very purpose or main purpose to begin with, and if it wasn't more so for just supplies. But it seems likely to me that that could also be a use for this tunnel. And this concrete tube housing so much death, spirits passing through it, maybe that's why it's one of the more haunted locations within Waverly. It's certainly the most creepy to me just because of its nature, and that it's a long, dark tunnel and you can't see the bottom.
It's a high traffic area for life and death, especially if you think about supplies coming in to support the hospital and then the dead going out through this tunnel. And then metaphorically, it's this long descent into darkness.
That's exactly right. But also, as you said, it had life as people were coming up from the bottom of the hill being dropped off. As we said before, once you decided to work at Waverly, you were there for the duration. You lived there. But stuff has to come in and still go out. And in this case, it seems just as many dead bodies were coming out of the tunnel as going in.
Another one of the more common stories that you hear about here are the little boy and the little girl that many, many people have seen in the sanatorium when they've been there. I actually want to read a little excerpt here from a website called AmericanHauntingsInc.com, and Inc is spelled I-N-K because the website belongs to author Troy Taylor, who we're hoping to have as a future guest on the show. He's given us permission to share some of these segments from his webpage on Waverly because they are well-written and concise. The hospital soon gained a reputation for being haunted, and stories began to circulate of resident ghosts, like the little girl who was seen running up and down the third-floor solarium, the little boy who was spotted with a leather ball, the hearse that appeared in the back of the building dropping off coffins, the woman with the bleeding wrists who cried for help, and others. Visitors told of slamming doors, lights in the windows as if power was still running through the building, strange sounds, and eerie footsteps in empty rooms. So what's interesting about this, you look at the little boy and the little girl, this is something that comes up a lot, and you will hear tonight Roger and Jill talk about a little bit.
Right, and her area is the third floor solarium, but I believe she can be seen in different parts of the building. You're not confined to one space. Maybe you are, I don't know, but people seem to see these specific apparitions in specific parts of the building, is all I can say. And the little boy, he's been seen carrying a leather ball, like a really old-fashioned football or a leather basketball from way back in the day. And so now people who visit, ghost hunters, will bring a ball for him to play with. And one story I heard, I can't remember where, but somebody left a ball in a room where they thought some activity was going on, went to another floor, the ball showed up there.
Oh.
People bring toys for him to play with, for him and the little girl as well, trying to engage them. And that's one method for paranormal investigators to actually try and get something to happen or get some evidence, is that you interact with them like they were real people. Like they're looking for visitors and wanting to play and wanting to interact with people. So that's one trick, you could say. People bring a ball for the little boy.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, and this is the case with a lot of these stories at Waverly, but also you'll find at other locations as well, is that there's not any specific information about who these people might be. They're just representations of lost spirits that seem to be stuck in this place and time.
Well, you bring up a fascinating point about this. It's kind of the reverse in that I believe that people are seeing these characters, these spirits. They're seeing something, a representation of a former human being. But who that person is, that's where it gets murky. Not in the ghost part. They're seeing these full body apparitions as as little kids. And I'm sure a lot of people at the time believed them to be real. It's like, well, what are you doing here at 2 in the morning in this abandoned building when you're 7? So sometimes they're seeing them. Sometimes it could be one of those things where you throw the ball down the hallway and it gets kicked back to you, but you never see what's doing it. So there's some interaction there. And like, as you said, you must keep this in mind as you hear these stories, in that we're kind of working backwards here, and that people have seen things at Waverly, representations of people, and we're trying to work backwards here to tie that to an actual historical person. But that's where it gets really murky and it's hard to do. And so what you'll see is that the legend fills that part in. It's like the sighting of a guy in a white coat who's sometimes seen walking through the kitchen or the bakery or the cafeteria, probably a worker formerly. Now that could be a ghost, that could be what we think is that visual echo of places that have had a lot of human activity. It's just repeating that. But along with that, as I mentioned before, people have smelled baking bread, food cooking, frying bacon, coffee, all kinds of kitchen smells, and hearing things, dishes clinking. You hear all kinds of this stuff. And so that might be different, but people have seen this guy in a white coat. And it sounds to me like, yeah, he could be a kitchen worker or a baker. But here's an example of a spirit that people have seen and have gotten a lot of evidence from, which the people who run Waverly believe is actually tied to a real person. And this person is Lois Higgs. You can go to her room, and there's a little plaque there with her picture on there. So I was taking video while I was in the room, Lois's old room. While I was in the room, I took a shot of the picture frame that has Lois's picture and a paragraph of her story on there. And I'm getting this story and facts also from Ernie, the tour guide, who was doing a great job of taking everybody around and explaining who the ghosts were that everybody sees and all the various locations they're tied to. So while we were in Lois's room, the story goes, sisters Lois and Audrey were both recuperating there. Audrey survived and went home. Lois, however, spent 8 years at Waverly before passing away at the age of 28 on August 18th, 1956. That age there I'm getting from my fuzzy video in infrared of, I think it said 28. And again, this is according to that sign that's posted in her room and what I remember Ernie telling me. But Lois is said to be a very kind spirit. She's a nice young woman. And she's very active, and she appears as a full-body apparition sometimes. There's a lot of voice communication through EVPs, and lots of signs letting visitors know that it's her, it's Lois. So she's very communicative, and that's how people know the name of who they're dealing with there.
Oh, that's fascinating. Let's talk about the 5th floor. That's the place that most people bring up as the place with the most activity at Waverly Hills, right?
It's one of them, but as we said, every floor seems to have their resident ghost. So the 4th floor, I think that's where the creeper lives. I don't know what keeps them from visiting other floors. I don't know what the rules are, other than these things seem to be more often reported in specific areas. So the 5th floor, though, has a lot of activity, and one of the more famous stories that come out of Waverly that apparently has some tie-in with the architecture there.
I want to go back to Troy's website
Yes.
that we mentioned earlier that he graciously gave us permission to read from. He's got some really good descriptions here of the 5th floor. He says, perhaps the greatest and most controversial legend of Waverly Hills is connected to the 5th floor of the building. This floor of the old hospital consisted of 2 nurses' stations, a pantry, a linen room, medicine room, and 2 medium-sized rooms on both sides of the 2 nurses' stations. One of these, room 502, is the subject of many rumors and legends, and just about every curiosity seeker that has broken into Waverly Hills over the years has wanted to see it. This is where, according to the stories, people have seen shapes moving in the windows, have heard disembodied voices, and, if the legends are to be believed, have even jumped to their deaths. There's a lot of legends about what went on in this part of the hospital, but perhaps the biggest misconception was that this was a floor used to house mentally ill tuberculosis patients. This was not the case. The patients here were not insane, nor were they confined to their rooms. They were free to move about, just like patients on all of the other floors of the hospital. Our hats off to Troy, by the way. He, like us, likes to do his research and try to separate the apocryphal information from the factual information, which is cool. This floor, thanks to its design, allowed patients to still benefit from the fresh air and sunshine that was believed to cure or at least extend the life of those with the disease. It was centered in the middle of the hospital, and the 2 wards extending out from the nurses' stations were glassed in on all sides and opened out onto a patio type roof. So now we come to the story of the nurse. There's a couple of nurse stories, right?
Yeah, well, of course, because there were a lot of nurses that worked there, you would expect to have a few. And these, unfortunately, are some of the more tragic stories related to the legends of Waverly Hills. And the first one is just a random story of a nurse who possibly fell to her death committing suicide, or she was pushed. That may tie in with the rumors of people who have jumped off of the roof at Waverly to their deaths back when it was unguarded. Again, these are hard to really tie to a real life case or specific incident in criminal records or any kind of records. So a nurse possibly died by falling off the roof or one of the floors. We're not sure which, we're not sure what nurse, but that is one of the rumors of the ghosts that are there. Another one of the nurse type stories, and this one's a lot more sad, was about an elderly woman who retired years ago. She was a former nurse, I think there at Waverly Hills, but now she was a patient there and she had advanced dementia of some kind, limited mental capacity, and she would follow the nurses around and trying to still do her duties. That's the legend, of course. But an attendant there, possibly a nurse, I don't know what her position was, but I'd heard it was a woman, had got annoyed at this elderly woman following her around on all of her rounds and duties, and led her into a room and locked the door. And I think that was the end of her weekend or her shift. This woman was forgotten about, and she was found 3 days later in the room and had died.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a sad thing that somebody gets annoyed and it's like, well, I'll just, keep you out of the way.
Yeah, that is sad. Not unheard of in a
No.
situation like that.
If
but-
that story is true.
Right.
So again, we have not really chased these down. And at some point, it doesn't really matter. Although if you're a serious ghost hunter and you're trying to interact and communicate with these spirits, that will help because it's better to call out a specific name than just yell, hey, you, out in a crowd of live people. So if you're doing that with ghosts, you can assume that also helps. Kind of like with Lois, you know who you're talking to. It's a real person. You can try and communicate with Lois Higgs and you'll get better results. So this third nurse's story that I heard is also a tragic one, and it is probably the most famous and infamous because it actually ties to a spot at Waverly, specifically a room 502.
Yes. Now, and you heard this one on the tour as well, right?
Yeah, of course, they tell it. They showed us the spot. And once you tell us the story, I'll give you my insights of having been there.
Okay. Again, I want to take this synopsis of the story for us from Troy Taylor's website, AmericanHauntingsInc.com, Inc. with a K. By the way, Troy is a very prolific author. He's got a lot of books online. You can find Haunted Illinois, Murdered in Their Beds, The Haunting of America. Just check him out on Amazon.com. And we'll have some links to his books there as well as James Willis's books. And here is Troy's description of, and it's as good as any as we've seen.
Yeah, it is.
Of what happened in room 502. According to the stories, a nurse was found dead in room 502 in 1928. She had committed suicide by hanging herself from the light fixture. She was 29 years old at the time of her death, unmarried and pregnant. Her depression over the situation led her to take her own life. It's unknown how long she may have been hanging in this room before her body was discovered, and this would not be the only tragedy to occur with a connection to room 502. So that's pretty fascinating, and we've heard a fair amount of variations on this story about where exactly she was, how she was hanging.
The variations,
was she pregnant? Was she not pregnant? There's a lot of fuzziness around it that tells us, based on our history of research on the show, that it's hard to know where the reality of this story is, if there is any.
Yeah.
But that room has seen a lot of activity from visitors.
Again, that's that case here of people are seeing a lot of activity in present day and modern recent history, and then trying to go back in time to tie that to a specific incident because, of course, that makes a better story. Also gives you some grounding and anchoring to something specific that we can wrap our heads around. But it's also what serious paranormal investigators try to do. You try to find a historical link to whatever hauntings you're experiencing or being reported, and that way you can get some context to it. But in this case, yes, there is a room 502. We were shown the room on the tour. And here's the thing about the room. It's not a patient room that somebody could go in and hang themselves. You can actually see the broken and uninstalled fixtures on the wall for the bathroom. And so then the story then shifts to accommodate that. So the story is now, oh, well, she didn't hang herself in the room by the rafters because there's no rafters in there. She hung herself outside of the room and from the pipes that are overhead. Well, those pipes are from a sprinkler system that was only installed in 1972, as that story goes.
Yeah, again, I don't know where you got that from, but I'm seeing it on Troy Taylor's website.
Yeah.
That information.
Yeah.
Which is
So,
interesting. I
right.
love that he dug that up.
That's the adjustment to the legend of that story. You know what I'm saying? It's like people were saying, like, well, it was a patient's room that she snuck into and that's where she hung herself. It's like, well, if you're going to do it in a bathroom, logically, like people are coming in and out. You know, there are nurses working there. This wasn't done after hours. She would have had to have accomplished that in a short amount of time before anyone walked in. So it's not the best, probably private place to attempt that anyway. But then neither again is the hall. And that's where people will say that, no, she actually hung herself either from the pipes above. And there are pipes. I have a shot of that. I took a picture of that. And there are pipes up there. And I don't know if it would hold a body, if it would just break upon anyone's weight. Or she hung herself by the light fixture. But that light fixture is decorative and it hangs by a chain. So it's kind of flimsy, probably wouldn't hold somebody. But there's also some to do about where she landed on the floor when they took her down. And of course, there's the true crime aspect, which is, was she really depressed about her pregnancy? And back then it was considered a shameful thing. And she was a working woman and this might have ruined her career. And so part of the legend is that a doctor there had gotten her pregnant. And so also she couldn't come forward with, who's the father and how this happened. It would ruin two careers. So she took her own life. Or the other variation on the true crime angle is that somebody offed her that didn't want this to come out and staged it as a suicide and hung her there. So again, it gets kind of wild. And of course, no one can find any actual documentation, as we'll hear later from our guest, Jim. Although, as Troy Taylor has stated in his article on his website, there is some claim that a former staff member named John Thornberry, who died in 2006, is one to confirm this, that he actually witnessed this woman being taken down having hung herself. However, according to his obituary, and this is again from Troy Taylor, he was born in 1922. So that would have made him way too young to have experienced this incident.
Yeah, he
in
would have been 6 or
1932.
10 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you pick one of those two deaths with those two nurses.
Right. So verifying that story is really difficult, if not impossible, okay? Because you can't really tie it to an obituary in a paper or even an article. And people will say like, well, there you go. They want to keep it hush-hush.
When you get into a situation like this, where especially there were a lot of deaths going on, and Troy had indicated in his email to us, there's a fair amount of exaggeration with the number of deaths, which is something we mentioned earlier. But the other thing that I would say to counterpoint that is that in a situation like this where so many people are dying, I would also say that the paperwork and the paper trails probably fall through the cracks a little bit.
Yeah.
So
it's not surprising one way or the other if it was true and there's no evidence of it, or if it just never happened and this is the resulting legend that comes out of that. Now, again, going back to people having real events happen to them or experiences, there was a fun one that's relayed in that documentary we mentioned by the Booth brothers called Spooked, The Ghosts of Waverly Hills, I think, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we recently watched that. And there is a band, of course, as we talked about earlier, since it's been abandoned, there's been a lot of bands that use it as a cool, creepy photo shoot area or a music video that they're trying to produce. And people have used that place when it was not guarded, as it has been since 2001, for their own purposes and usually trying to get away with something. And there was a local band called 502 Incursion.
yes.
And that's referring to that room. So I think that they're in the documentary as being interviewed.
Yes.
So it's a fun story. Who can tell if what they're saying is actually true or accurate? But I think the lead singer of the band, the lead member of the band, was saying that someone in that band had stolen the number off that door. What I had heard was that the owners found out about that later and were not very pleased, of course, because you don't want people taking stuff from the place, especially that's a very iconic door number.
Yeah.
So somebody in the band had stolen that. The lead singer takes it home and he just starts to have a lot of bad luck, loses a job. He gets kicked out of his rental place. So he gave it to another member of the band, and that band member, I think the bassist, has put it on his amp. And he's not had bad luck since. So there you go. It could be kind of apocryphal. It could be just coincidence. But there's a story that there's something about 502.
Well, this brings us down to the last two stories that we were going to share from there. One of them is about a homeless man who lived in the building with his dog, right?
Yeah, that story is often told, and it's kind of heartbreaking in a way because, again, people throughout the years had been breaking in and using the place for their own purposes. Here was a homeless veteran, it was said, and his dog. And I think it was a white German Shepherd mix of some kind. That's what people described it as. And he had been living in there, squatting, but he wasn't destructive. So there was security at the time, and he'd been kind of evading it. But eventually they caught up with him and his, wherever he'd been camping out there. And they were telling him, you can't live in here. You got to go. And he explained his situation. I think it was a homeless vet. Again, that's me adding to the legend where it makes a slightly better story because you have more empathy for that character. He's struggling and he couldn't find his way. And here he is, at least he's got a place for him and his dog. And the way the story goes is that he explained to them, like, look, please don't kick me out. I don't have anywhere to go. I am chasing other people out. I'm keeping the place clean. I'm picking up here. I'm doing a little bit to help out when I can. But please don't kick me out. I'll help you guys out. I'll keep an eye on the place when you can't be here. I'll help, run security. And they were like, oh, okay, fine. You don't have to go. As long as you're helping out and you're not causing a problem here, not destroying things, we'll let you stay here. You seem to be coherent enough that, he could keep his promise and help out. So then while it's under his watch, a group of either rowdy teens or evil-minded goth kids.
Evil-minded goth kids.
Well, yeah, because there's the goth kids who don't really bother anybody. They just hang out
Which
at the
I would
post
say is
office.
99.9.
They're not
but
really,
okay.
They're there more for the looks and to do their own things.
Yes.
But this was a group of goth kids that were up to no good.
Convenient bad guys.
Yeah, or devil worshippers.
Oh, of course.
But I would like to quote the great Fox Mulder in saying, just because there were bogus witch trials doesn't mean there weren't witches.
Ooh.
I just saw that recently, actually.
Yeah.
That's the only way I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so the point is that who knows who broke in there? That's part of the legend. You can see how these things are forming, right? So a group breaks in there. Next thing we know, the poor man and his dog are found at the bottom of the elevator shaft. And we don't know if he fell or if he was pushed. And I think the way the story lays out was that he had reported that these other kids or whoever this bad group was had broken in and he told them to leave. They came back. They didn't like that. And they came back again and they just did away with them. Or it's a possibility. So that's the way that story plays out. But here's the angle, which I believe is true. Tina Mattingly, along with her husband Charlie, who have been taking care of the building since 2001, apparently she did see a male figure with a white-looking dog somewhere in the hallway while she was working there. That's interesting. That's where you have the sighting and you back that up into a story. So what I will believe is that there probably was a squatter there who was allowed to stay since he was helping out. But how he died, who knows? Did he really end up at the bottom of the elevator shaft? Was he pushed? Did he die of natural causes? Did he fall in? Who knows? That's a little sketchy, but so I met Tina very briefly, but I know a lot of people who do know her a lot better, and she does come off as a very no-nonsense person. And if she's claiming that that's one of the things she saw there, like, well, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt that she saw the dog and the man there. So that's one of the more famous ghost sightings there seen.
That brings us to our last story associated with Waverly, or of the ones that we've decided to share here on Astonishing Legends. And that's the one about the group of kids that broke in, I guess, intending to do a little harm to the building.
Well, a lot of kids did, yeah. I mean, here's what I think local residents will tell you. It's that people will go up there to make out, drink beer, spray paint the place, break windows, that kind of stuff. But this was my favorite story, I think, out of all the ones I heard about the place, because I actually saw evidence of it. And as you alluded to, yes, I think a lot of local kids, that was the thing. You go up to Waverly, you drink beer, you hang out, you do a little spray painting maybe, you break some windows, you steal some cool medical equipment. That's with every abandoned building like that. That happens. Or maybe you don't do any vandalism at all. Some people are into legend tripping where they just go like to check out abandoned buildings. But I will say, I will stress this again, it is all private property, no trespassing allowed. Do not go up there. That actually happened while I was there, and they are on it like that. They will see you on camera. You will be met immediately and escorted off the property. Don't try and get away with anything. So it's all locked up, and they don't need any more vandalism, okay? Go drink your warm beer somewhere else, kids. So again, this is one of my favorite stories because not only the way it was told to me, but it's one of the more spooky stories. So there was a group of boys, 3 or 4, I don't know how many, but they had gotten a hold of a fire axe or some kind of axe, and they were intent on breaking into Waverly to do a little spray painting and a little bit of good old-fashioned vandalism. Well, they were successful. They used the axe to break into a window, and they crawled inside. Now, as the story's told, usually people who break in want to avoid the security guys. But in this case, they were yelling and screaming for them. They were yelling and screaming for anybody to come save them because they were trapped in a room. So one of the security people had heard this yelling and screaming, and he went up to the door, and it's a metal door. He flings the door open quite easily, and they're so happy to see him. Really effusive in their thank yous, like, you saved us. We couldn't get out. And the security guard was baffled. It's like, well, what are you doing here? There's no lock on this door. Like, yeah, we couldn't get out. The door was locked. He said, take a look. There's no doorknob on this door. There's no latch. It swings open easily. And the boys say, well, you don't understand. We got in here, and yes, we were going to spray paint. We're going to do a little vandalism. But then a group of shadows closed in on us, and they wouldn't let us leave. We tried hacking our way out. Again and again, the door wouldn't budge until you opened it. And on the tour guide will show you that there is no latch. There's just a handle on the door. There's no knob, and the door swings open very easily. And on the inside of the door are about 20 or 30 chop marks from the axe. So at some point, someone had desperately tried to get out of that room using an axe.
So that's a pretty crazy story. I think the craziest part about it was where you said, yes, we were going to spray paint and vandalize things. So they said that to the security guard?
That's the story where they were, well, of
maybe
course,
they said,
they're
we're
going
going to tag stuff, man. Did they were just like, no, we were just hanging out.
we were going
I like how in your version,
it.
they just immediately confessed and they used old people terms for tagging.
Well,
we're going to spray paint things.
Yeah, they were doing some Homer Formby touch-up work.
Right.
Obviously, they're in a room where they shouldn't be, in a locked building with an axe and a can of spray paint. So
the bottom line is whatever happened, the fact that they were caught in the act of doing something they shouldn't be doing was the least concern they had.
Yeah, obviously, look, there's no sense of saying, like I just said, like, we're here to do some repair work at 3 a.m. Come on. And we just got trapped in here. Here's the bottom line of the story. You can see the chop marks with the axe, like deep ones, into the metal on the inside of the door, and the door does swing open. Now, back at that time, that hallway was probably filled with a lot of junk. You got to keep that in mind. But for somebody to have done that, then they would have had to prop the door open and then hack at it with an axe on the inside of the door. You know what I'm saying? Because there's no way to lock the door, then hack at it from the inside, holding it down. And if you're going to believe the ghostly aspect of this, the black shadow specters that all crowded around them and were going to punish them for disrespecting the place, then some force of that was so strong that it held the door closed while they hacked at it. So that's why it's my favorite story. You can actually see the chop marks.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's one story where you can actually see some evidence of something weird. And like you said, okay, so maybe it's regular vandalism, but it's weird that it's just on that edge of the door on the inside, not all over the door, like somebody's just kind of drunk maybe and just hacking at it.
Yeah.
It's like they were trying to get at that seam.
Right.
On the
See,
right
that's
side of the
interesting
door.
because, the first thing I think is, someone propped the door open and went in there and it was just routine vandalism. They're just throwing an axe at the door or axing the door. But your point was, because you saw it, I didn't see it, I wasn't with you, is that the marks are close to the seam of the door as though someone was trying to use it to open the door, not just chopping randomly at the door.
That's what sold it for me is that, it wasn't chop marks all over the door, or they were trying to chop the little wired window that's in some doors that you can see in. They weren't trying to break anything. It looked as though somebody was going from the top down to the midsection of the door, on the door itself, which was made of galvanized metal, I think, of some kind of thinner metal, not solid steel, of course.
Like a standard kind of warehouse type door.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Not a fire door, but thin enough that you could make a cut into it with an axe. And there looked to be, I don't know, maybe 10, 20, 30 chop marks in there. It looked a little frantic. So that's my favorite story.
I don't know where you're at in Best Fiends, man, but I am loving that game.
Like a level 175. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, you're doing good.
Well, I've been at it for a bit now.
My wife has always been into puzzle games, but this is the first one I've really gotten into. I love the way it looks, and the gameplay is excellent. I've become obsessed with unlocking new characters.
Yeah, it's no surprise it's a 5-star rated game, and I really like the characters in it too. Most of them are bugs, except for the bad guys. The bad guys are slugs.
I kind of like the slugs.
You're always rooting for the underdog, aren't you?
Well, I mean, I like them, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to take them out so I can level up.
Ah, I see. Well, the other thing I like about it is that it's updated monthly with new levels and events, so you never get bored with it like you do some other games. And the more you play, the more you realize it's like its own little world.
And you don't have to be a hardcore gamer to play it. It's a casual game. I mean, the family can play it, but really it's designed for adults. And you can challenge friends to beat your progress or help them out and stay connected through social media too.
It is different from the other puzzle games out there and more exciting to play, honestly. With 100 million downloads globally, Best Fiends is on the rise. And here's the other thing. You don't even have to have internet access to play it, so it's great for traveling or when you're offline for whatever reason.
If you guys are looking for a fun new mobile game, engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of characters with Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a 5-star rated mobile game on the Apple App Store and Google Play where you can download it free. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends.
This is Sarah. Searching for mystery, intrigue, and lore? You've come to the right place. Here's more astonishing legends.
Hey folks, we are back with James A. Willis, who you heard on the show last week. It's been a very well-received show, and we wanted to bring him back because in the intervening time, we actually recorded that interview with him way back in June of this year because we were trying to stockpile some shows up because we had some heavy lifting to do this summer. And since that happened, he and Forrest and some of our other friends who you're going to hear about tonight actually went to a lockdown at Waverly Sanatorium. I was unavailable to attend that, and I wouldn't have
if you
I
were
could
available.
have, yeah.
I'm not sure you would have gone anyway.
Yeah, so we just want to say, first of all, welcome back to the show, Jim. We're so glad to have you back on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. It's been a while, I guess. Maybe not.
It has been. Not for the listeners, it's only been a week, but for
Right.
us, it's been some time. So, Forrest, I think you kind of had an idea of where we wanted to go with this interview. We were going to talk to you, Jim, about what it's like being a serious paranormal or ghost investigator, and as Forrest says, not just one that you see on TV.
I do believe a lot of them are very serious about it and want to get good evidence and want to present something genuine because they believe in this subject, in this genre. But at the same time, when you're on TV, TV has its own requirements, its codicils and contracts and expectations. And we, the viewer, are responsible for a lot of that. We demand to see some action, not just people sitting in a dark room on infrared for 4 hours and nothing happens. We want to see results. And so that forces TV producers and executives to goad these people, these researchers, into providing spooks and chills and thrills. And when you don't have that constraint on you, you can then get some really decent evidence and do the procedure of ghost hunting seriously and with a scientific mind to it and a scientific eye. And that's exactly, I think, what James does. And for myself, I find that fascinating, and I wanted to know more about it. And I certainly didn't know much of anything going to Waverly Hills, but this is a great opportunity to talk to a serious professional in this field and find out, how do they do it? How does a paranormal lockdown, a ghost hunt, really go? What do you do for it? So I guess leading off, Jim, like, you've been to a lot of locations so far. And you've been to many of them several times because, as we just said, you don't often get stuff on 2, 3, 4, 5 visits. And on that 5th or 6th visit, maybe you get something really dramatic and spectacular or just worthwhile. How do you start off choosing your locations?
That's a great question. For me, it's sort of a mixture of we will get calls from private residents who want us to actually come out and investigate their homes or their businesses. So those would take precedence and they kind of pick us as vice versa. But when it comes to sort of those public locations where you're actually going in, like a Waverly Hills or a Mansfield Reformatory, those sort of things, I will sort of look at the legends and the ghost stories associated with it, but I'm kind of old school in that I want something that's got a lot of history to it, not necessarily even ghostly history, but just regular history, so that if I go to the location and I walk out with absolutely nothing in terms of ghost evidence, I still can walk away being really excited that I got to sort of peek behind the curtain and see things that way. So it's sort of a mixture when it comes to there. It's something that my ghostly spidey sense for these locations is like, well, that's kind of interesting. I wonder if there's something there. And then I'll start thinking through in my head the different ways that we can go into that sort of location and do, for lack of a better term, a controlled experiment, knowing that that probably does not exist in this field, but we can try really hard to get it as controlled as possible. So some of these haunted locations are really cool to visit, but in terms of actually trying to lock it down, you've got everything from too many open areas that are going to echo, because haunted houses all have the echoing staircases and the hallways where it's just a logistical nightmare to even try to do any sort of audio. So a lot of that goes into play when we're going out to these public locations.
Yeah, because there's no furniture. Often it's abandoned. There's no windows. So you're just really looking at a lot of hard angular surfaces everywhere you go, which is, like you said, it's a nightmare for audio.
Yeah, it is. And it also becomes when you start to have to look at the idea that, okay, well, we're going to bring video cameras in. Well, the first time that we went up to Mansfield, which was 15 years ago, I think, they didn't really have power in most of the building. And so we had to rent 2 generators to actually power the video equipment and the DVRs and that sort of thing, which then in turn messed up all of our audio, because in the background you had to try to get the audio in a place where you could record and weren't getting the generator hum coming through.
Right. Right. So that brings up something that's pretty significant that you don't really think about. But what is the point of a lockdown? Why are you locking down? The point of that is to minimize interference that could be misconstrued as evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, for the TV shows, it sounds spookier that we were locked down, and that we can't escape, that sort of thing. But you're exactly right. For us, the locking it down is to try to get it as controlled an environment as possible. And that's all the way down from, if a lot of times, even if we go into a private residence, well, that's on a public street. You have to take into consideration that if we do it on a weekend, there was an infamous case that we did over a July 4th weekend where the owners were being very quiet, but back across their field, they had a lot of property, but the neighbors were having, I joke and say, I think the official term was a hootenanny. And they literally had a Mr. Microphone that they were getting into and screaming over at random times. Well, the first time you hear that, it's nerve-wracking. But after a while, you're like, well, we've got to throw all of this audio out because there was so much potential for contamination.
Yeah, I can imagine. So that obviously must, I guess when you do your research or initial research to find a good place to go hunting, do you then find certain locations better than others? Just, you can read the layout and you're like, you know what, this is really, it's out in the middle by itself. There are better parameters. I mean, Waverly was like that in that there was very limited power only on the first floor, I think, in kind of the green room where the gift shop is, right, and where the ghost hunters congregate before they set out. But the rest of the building has no power, and a lot of it's just open to the air.
Mm-hmm.
And so are there places that when you look at the specs on it, it's like, okay, this is a great place, or this place is going to be challenging, but we should go anyway? And in combination with that, do you find when you research the history, some places seem to be a better setup or yield more results?
Yeah, definitely. And where it gets further intriguing to me, but also frustrating, is sometimes when you have a building that's out in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have power, that ends up working in your favor, because when you're walking around with, say, EMF detectors, they shouldn't really be doing anything. And if they are, that kind of ups the ante that there could be something paranormal taking place there, because it's detecting something that shouldn't be there. You also then get in the habit, when you sort of look at the history, and when you get into the specifics with the ghost history, then you have to look at, is this activity, could it be considered residual? At which point, the idea of the residual being it's the same thing that's repeated over and over again, we would want to look into the history to see when that event took place, and then go out there at that particular time or within that range, 4 hours back and forth in either direction, to see if something happened there. So then you go out and you bring all of the residual type equipment and you get nothing. Well, that means you got to go back and say, well, maybe it's intelligent and maybe it wasn't there at that particular time. So that very often, based on not only the location itself, but the type of history we get, as well as the ghost stories, will help us dictate whether we start trying to look for an intelligent or a residual. but 9 times out of 10, we end up going back trying to find the other one after that.
That's fascinating. So what you're saying really is that it makes me think of the case that Brandon Masulo highlighted when we were at the Kent Paranormal Weekend and we met you, in that a young man had fallen off of scaffolding back at the turn of the century and broken his neck, and there was what he determined to be a residual crisis apparition of some sort, where the people living in that house in the 50s that belonged to the mother of that boy, where she first heard it, were experiencing this repeated pattern of him running. They could hear the cry for help, and it was at a very specific time, because that's when he fell. And I believe that's when that was happening. So when you go to a location and say maybe you do the historical research and you said, well, around this time on this day, this event happened, which was pretty traumatic. Do you then try to really go back to the anniversary of that day, or just be around at that specific time if you know it?
We try to go within a 6-hour window before and after, because the joke that I usually make is that how do we know that ghosts are going to adhere to daylight savings time?
Right.
But a great example would be from the show that I was on, when we actually went out and I was able to find the Thurber house that he had actually, James Thurber, in the story, the night the ghost got in, he gave a date and a time when he had experienced hearing something walking around and then running up the steps at him. I was able to find that within that time frame, years before that, before the Thurber house was there, the Columbus Mental Asylum was there and burnt down there. And there are reports of patients that were running around, sadly, on fire. So that got me excited. And so we went back there on the anniversary, and we stood in the same exact spot that Thurber stood when he had his original encounter, and nothing happened. And then we went back as part of the Thurber house. We did a raffle.
This is the story that's in last week's show, which you probably don't remember from June, but you did talk about this. The listeners are a little bit familiar with this story, just so you know.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So we went back the first time we did that raffle, and there was a contest winner and a guest, and they came and we did the same thing. They stood in the same exact spot. They were more interested in the fundraising aspect as opposed to the ghost hunting part. But again, nothing happened. So at that point, I think, back to what we were talking about earlier, television shows would have abandoned this episode a long time ago, because they're like, okay, you guys were out here twice and nothing has happened. This is not going to work. But we did the raffle last year, and the winner and their guest who won they were over the moon. I mean, the Thurber house actually called me and said, when we announced the winner, this person called and was screaming on the phone. They were so excited. And we put them in the same exact, so we did it again. And that's the audio clips that I gave you guys.
Yes.
So something happened. And as a television show, they would have gotten excited, got rid of the first couple of times we went out there and just went to that one, because again, it's ratings. And I get that. For me, it's exciting, but also incredibly frustrating, because now we have to sit down and say, why didn't it happen those other 2 times that we were there at the same exact time? Was that the ghost wasn't there at that particular time? Or was it even the equipment that we had? Or to push it even further, was it the mixture of people that were in the house at the time? Was it the fact that the people that were there were really excited and really into it, that the ghost said, you know what, I'm going to hang with these people for a while. I'm going to make an appearance. So those are the things that keep me up at night that I love. But, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I totally get why a ghost television show is not going to be able to dedicate that sort of time to an episode. They need results, and they need something that's going to get continued visitors.
We have a friend of the show who I believe calls herself a medium, right, Forrest? Not necessarily psychic, but a medium.
Depending on who you're talking about here.
I'm talking about Debbie Chestnut.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure she would go full on medium as a descriptor for herself, but she's very intuitive and is one of those people that can look at photos sometimes and get a very strong impression, even I think some mental images. So yeah, so in that way, yes.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that, she would bill herself as that.
Well, I just wanted to properly attribute her, because one of the things that she had said about my encounter at the Sally house was that part of the reason that I experienced what I experienced was because whatever was there had singled me out possibly as incredulous. So,
I also put Scott doesn't know this, but I put a word in at the house before we got there to really razz him from the spirits, and they delivered. Because I thought, like, well, if anybody needs a good spook and a jump start on this stuff, it's Scott.
well, that was the first time that I considered the idea and have, obviously had a personal experience with it now that, going to your point, Jim, about the mixture of people at the house, to me, I don't have to take a long walk to believe that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's something that we have over the years with the Ghosts of Ohio. We have gone where we kind of shift back and forth between being all the way, it's like all equipment. I mean, we will show up with like multiple SUVs full of equipment and we just kind of layer things out. And then one of us will inevitably say, well, with all this equipment, there could be a ghost standing right behind us waving. And we are so focused on the monitors and the equipment and looking for lights to go that we're not paying attention to the ghost that could be right behind us. So then we'll go the complete opposite thing and we will go so low tech that we are literally just sitting, we'll have the recorders and the DVRs going, but we're literally just sitting in the dark rooms asking people, is there anyone here? Introducing ourselves and just trying to have a conversation. So we also have gotten to the point where we are trying to say, well, how do we as investigators come across? Because if you think about it, if you're walking into anyone's house or home for the first time, the people, if they don't know you, are going to be like, well, okay, what are you doing here? What are you up to? And then we start unpacking all of these things that if they can see us, they're like, what are you doing? So it could, again, that gets into my infamous 2-bottle conversation where you need 2 bottles of your
Yes.
favorite alcoholic refreshment to get into this. But is our behavior increasing or decreasing the level of ghost activity? Are the ghosts showing up and being like, I'm done with you guys. I ain't hanging with you. I'm going to go down the street, watch ghostly ESPN with my neighbors and then come back later. It's something that, to go back to these ghost shows, when I do watch them, which is very infrequently, but I end up rooting for the ghosts because some of them go in there and they start yelling and they're belligerent. They're like, why don't you do something if you're so bad? And they inevitably get punched or kicked or knocked downstairs or something. But part of me is like, well, you asked for that. You came into someone's home and we're acting like a jackhole and you kind of get what you deserve. So I to that end, I don't even think necessarily the ghosts are bad or evil for doing that. I think you just kind of tick them off. So we have tried to do, some of us will just do simple like recentering exercises. Some of us will meditate. A couple of us will just go off and sit down before an investigation and quietly just sort of decompress and be like, okay, I've got to put aside all of the troubles and things that I have to deal with the world out there because I'm here to investigate. I want to try to make contact. So let me just get refocused. And we started getting better evidence that way. So I do think there is something to the way that you go into an investigation. If you are open to it and not even in the back of your mind got 12 different things going on about, I got to pay the mortgage when I get home and I got to get up and do this. If you can just focus on it and be in that moment, it started working for us.
That's great advice. I think that's really great advice about clearing your mind for it.
Oh, absolutely. And, you hit on a point there that I'd heard about Tina and Charlie Mattingly, who run Waverly Hills now, and, that they do not tolerate, if they can catch you, provoking the spirits there because they were very respectful of anything that might be residing there, the building itself, the history of it, for what it was. And they don't put up with people going around trying to provoke whatever spirits might be there for a reaction. And in connection to that, though, that's kind of the actions that you're doing while you're there and your mindset. But on another branch of that kind of questioning, do you find that there are some people naturally who are more, I guess, magnets for this type of activity? And does that influence your choice of team members at a particular place? Like, for example, I know some people that they seem to get some kind of reaction no matter where they go. They are some kind of conduit, it seems. And when you bring them, you're going to get maybe more results because just of who they are and what their personal energy is like. Do you find that's the case when you go out with your team?
Yes. Yeah, definitely. I think I mentioned that my organization, I sort of handpicked people over the years, and we run the gamut from total skeptic to true believer, including some that believe that they are sensitive or can pick up on things. And I do that purposely because it's kind of like I've created this ghostly tackle box, if you will, of investigators that I can, based on the type of activity and where it's taking place, I can sort of handpick certain people that I think might be not only open to the experience, but I think that the spirits might be more open to. A good example was that we recently did an investigation at a library that we did confirm that the first librarian was unfortunately shot and murdered in the building. She was the first librarian of this entire library. It went back many, many years, but we do have a librarian who is a member of the Ghosts of Ohio. So we brought her on the investigation, and we did, for a period of time, have her just sit quietly and introduce herself and just say, okay, I'm a librarian too. What's your favorite part of the job? What did you love about this place? So again, trying to make a personal connection with this, because if we're wanting to get results, we're wanting something to talk to us, we want to be people that are worthy of being spoken to and not being ignored. So there's other instances where, strangely enough, it was another library where we got the Wendy laugh from. Obviously, when we went back, we wanted to bring Wendy and to see if that could happen again. And oddly enough, I went back because I was the one who heard the Wendy laugh, and total different topic for another day. But we had other weird things happen involving what could have been Wendy's voice, not laughing, but hearing her voice speaking in a place where she wasn't at the time. And then lo and behold, we have my voice on a recording that is not in there. I was not in the area at the time that was recorded. There's actually, if you look at the video, there's nobody in that area. So how my voice got on there, as I said, a different topic for a different day. But again, that was looking at, okay, we went in there this time and we got something that seemed to be tied to Wendy. Well, let's put her back in the mix. We will also have people that, if we just bring them out and they do pick up on something, that something feels odd.
Well, I do believe that context makes a big difference in just exactly what you were saying. And I didn't do that. It was very tumultuous, my personal getting there and just physically and being kind of in a whirlwind of this new experience. And what I didn't realize until the week was done, and I was back and trying to get more examples and more audio files with the DR60, in that you're talking to somebody potentially, even if you believe in demons or some kind of other non-human entities out there doing some kind of communication. Probably you don't want that kind of interaction. But if it's a human spirit, you're actually talking or trying to talk and communicate and relate to someone who used to exist. And when I thought about that with the recorder, it's like I'm going into a room, and if you just turn it on, well, imagine if you walked up to somebody, some stranger on the street, and you pointed a recorder at them, and you just said nothing, or you said, do you have anything to say? And it's like, I'm sorry, what, who are you? What are you doing? Are you asking me a question? What do you want? It's like, you don't do that to regular people that you know. You have to be very specific. That's one thing that I didn't realize till later, and that probably affects what you get. You have to relate. And that's something that Jill and Roger Pingleton do. They really relate to the location just like you do. And, if it's a Civil War location, it's like, were you injured in this battle that happened here in Kentucky? They really try and get to the context of it. And so now, leading into that idea for Waverly, what are the first steps that you take when you know you're going to Waverly and you've been there before? How do you set that up?
Waverly is a different animal altogether, because as you said, I've been there a few times before, but I also knew that I was going there to be the bait again for Roger and Jill and for you, Forrest. So that was sort of my primary thing, is that, okay, we're going to go back and try to recreate the creeper, whatever that was, on the fourth floor. And so in my mind, I was sort of envisioning where I was, and we had gone back a second time, and tried to recreate it. So I was familiar with that specific area on the fourth floor. But thinking through how I thought it would play out, there is obviously a long section of dark hallway. So wanted to think that, okay, if it's coming up behind me or in front of me, we should probably have some sort of handheld devices on the floor that either constantly have lights on or will light up, so that we can tell if something is coming down the hallway. The problem is, according to legend, the creeper is supposed to be up on the ceiling. So that raised the second question, well, how can we get lights that are up on the ceiling as well? And that's where Roger brought his laser grid, which you could just shoot down the hallway, but you could also shoot it above, up onto the ceiling. So that was my primary focus of how to figure out what type of equipment we could get up there. Again, knowing that we were probably going to be limited to handheld video equipment as well as audio because there is no power and we didn't want to lug across state lines, as it were, the generators to get that power up there. So it was trying to figure out how to do that was the main focus. But in general, it was taking a look at the idea that Waverly, if any of your listeners, if they haven't been there, if they just look it up online, they will see that it is a gigantic structure sitting on top of a hill that, because they believe that fresh air would help the patients, it is not only facing into the wind, but it's nothing but windows and open balconies. So you're going to pick up a lot of breezes and drafts. Something that I feel I should add, though, that I thought was just very heartwarming is, since I had been there the last time, the owners had actually installed a lot of new windows, which are not cheap, but it was really, that's what I like to see when you go to these places and you can actually see where your money is actually going. You are literally going there and helping preserve history. So it was sort of heartwarming to see that, wow, a couple of floors actually have windows, which in turn helped with some of the audio, because we didn't have to worry about picking up sort of the whispering stuff that could be mistaken for, ghost voices. So that was mainly what I started looking at in general is, okay, I'm going into a location. I probably have to bring about, I think I brought 12 pounds worth of batteries for the handhelds, but that I was going to be limited to that. And also a whole bunch of chargers for my rechargeable batteries, knowing that down in the general area, the kind of bullpen where they kind of let us go and have our snacks has electricity, so I could plug things in that way. I think what I normally do is, because I'd been to Waverly several times, I had a lot of their history within it, as well as each time I'd gone and gotten a new story or a new area. So sort of just laying out my map of Waverly and looking at the history and saying, okay, well, these are the areas that I want to focus on, not only because of the ghost reports, but also the history. For me, the most intriguing part of Waverly, other than the fourth floor, where I'm firmly convinced there's something there, what it is, I haven't the foggiest, but is up on the fifth floor, because you have all these people saying that there are these reports of the nurse, and they will say all of these different stories, and they will have reports of the nurse being seen outside the room on the fifth floor. But it is incredibly hard to find any real documentation about that nurse. Not only who she was, they will give you names, but those names I have not been able to find an actual person tied to. It even comes down to, I can't even keep track of all the different versions, but she hanged herself. Somebody hanged her and made it look like a suicide. She was pregnant at the time. She wasn't pregnant at the time. She was hanged in the elevator shaft. She was hanged in the hallway. She was hanged in the room. She was pushed out. There are just so many versions that you kind of want to throw your hands up and go, I think this is all made up.
Right.
But then the flip side of that is so many people go into that area and report things, including seeing, hearing footsteps that sound like, nurses' shoes moving around, that you then have to really dig down in there and go, is this almost a golem? I mean, was there nothing there? But so many people have actually over the years done something that they literally did create a ghost there, which again, that's probably a 3-bottle conversation. But
that's
but
that's
it's
the tulpa
intriguing.
theory.
Yeah.
So many people have focused mental image of what they think is there, or tied that to an actual experience that they had there, that over time, it does form some kind of identity.
You're exactly right. Tulpa was the word I was looking for.
Oh, yeah.
But you could push that even further and just say that if what happened to me was actually a doppelganger, and separate from me, there are people that do report seeing doppelgangers at Waverly. Are they being brought out, these doppelgangers? Because nobody's really sure what they are and what they want, but how are those being created?
Yeah.
Are they being created just from people going there and just creating these stories that it's kind of created this creature, if you will?
So as you may have heard me talk about setting up the experience for myself, I was really disjointed, discombobulated at the very beginning of the tour here. I got a bag of gear. I don't know how to run. I missed the first part of the structured tour where Ernie was one of the tour guides who was taking people around. And it was a fairly large group, which is fun, but also poses some problems, as we're going to hear. When you have a large group that's not totally coordinated, they're just, some people who wanted to experience it, some people who were there for a real investigation and had gear, and all that's fine. It's just that kind of poses some problems. So I was running around at the very beginning while it was still daylight, trying to take photos of the outside of the place. And I didn't know where anybody else was. I thought this is probably a bad idea for me to just go into the bowels of Waverly looking for other people when I didn't know my way around. And then that's where I get trapped in a room. And 2 days later, like, what happened to Forrest? So I was running around. I missed all that. And I was going to ask Jim, where did you first go to set up? What did you first do when you got there as you were getting your gear together?
And I have to apologize because I kind of left you because I got really excited and I went in there. And then when I turned around, you were somewhere. And I was like, okay, well, we'll find him eventually. I think they're locking the gate so he can't go too far. But what I normally like to do when I go to not just a building as big as Waverly, but any location is I'll just kind of unload and throw all of my equipment into like a central area where I know where it is. And then I will sort of just wander around. It was an interesting thing that one of our newer members, Josh and Sarah, they're actually a husband and wife duo, that in just talking to him about the experiences that he's had, he's gone on a lot of public hunts as well. And I asked him, well, how do you determine where you should go when you get to these locations? Because I normally would just go, okay, these are the hot spots. These are where I need to go to first. And he just matter-of-factly said, I let the building tell me where to go.
Ooh.
And I thought that was fascinating. And we as a group have kind of taken that to heart in that when we pull up to a location, again, we kind of do that recentering, take a couple of minutes, couple of deep breaths, and then just walk around. It doesn't matter how big or little it is, just walk around and see, am I getting pulled in a certain direction? Because again, I think what has happened over the years is the world has just kind of crushed all of our collective spirits that we kind of need to recenter ourselves, push that all aside and let our intuition. There's probably a bunch of things that are out there trying to get our attention, but we are so busy, we don't focus on it. So just the idea of walking around with a kind of clear head and letting the building tell you where to go is something that's really started working for me personally. So what I did is I went and my wife Steph was with me. We just walked around the outside of the building, taking pictures, but also, you know what, for some reason, I think I should take a picture of these windows. And then nothing was in the windows, but you never know. Was something telling you, hey, take my picture? We do that all the time on investigations where we're like, could we take your picture? Could you stand in front of this? Well, maybe they can't do that, but who knows? Maybe you're being drawn by something telling you, take a picture of that chair, take a picture of this. So that's what we did. We just walked around the outside, kind of took our time, just looked up and down, looked down into the woods, looked all around and took a bunch of pictures and didn't really get anything in the pictures or any feelings, but that was what we did. And then when we had the actual tour, again, I put in the back of my head, these are the areas I want to focus on, but then put them in the back of my mind and kind of took the tour and just, if I started feeling, okay, I think I should be going down this hallway, I think I should be going here, I would sort of, I hope legally, wander away from the tour a little bit and just sort of see if I could pick up on anything. And it was a very, very thorough and detailed tour that took us all the way from the bottom. So we started down with the death tunnel, the body chute, went all the way up to the 5th floor and then all the way back down again. And where I feel bad about that, Forrest, is I probably should have dragged you along a little bit for that, if for no other reason that I didn't realize until afterwards that it was your first time there and you just got thrown into a 5-story building that certain staircases only go to certain floors. And so I do apologize for leaving you wandering around in Waverly.
That's quite all right. It would have been okay, I think, for Scott if we were
I
together.
wouldn't have been there. So it wasn't a possibility.